A German officer captured near Mortain in August 1944 sat across from an American interrogator and tried to explain something he could not fully explain to himself. He had fought in Poland. He had fought in France. He had fought in Russia. 5 years of war had taught him what artillery was, how it sounded, how it built toward you with ranging rounds, so a trained man could read the danger and take cover before the killing shells arrived. But the Americans did not fire that way. There was no warning, no ranging, no slow walk of the shells toward the target. The fire of many batteries arrived in a single sudden instant, on one exact stretch of road, at one exact minute, before the men in the lead vehicles could even shout the order to scatter. And then it came again, and again. He had counted, on one road, 4 seconds. 4 seconds between the first sound in the sky and the moment an entire platoon simply ceased to exist. By the late summer of 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had come to believe something their own professional training told them was impossible. They believed American artillery could not be survived if it caught you in the open. And the strangest part is this: they were almost right, and almost none of them ever understood why. On the morning of August 7, 1944, a little before dawn, a 21-year-old second lieutenant from Indiana lay behind a low wall of loose stones on the summit of a rocky hill in Normandy. The American maps called the hill 314. His name was Robert Weiss, and he had been an officer in the United States Army for less than a year. He was pressing a radio handset against his ear, and he was trying to keep his voice flat. Below him, in the valley, the fog was beginning to thin. Through his binoculars he could see the outlines of tanks moving along a road, dark shapes sliding through the gray light, one after another after another. He had first seen them roughly 4 hours earlier. He had been reading map coordinates into the handset ever since. The stone wall was cold against his chest, and the cold came up through his elbows and into his teeth. He had not slept. His mouth was dry in the way that had nothing to do with thirst. Every few minutes he wiped the lens of his binoculars with a corner of his sleeve, because the damp Normandy air kept fogging the glass, and a fogged lens on this particular morning could cost a man his life without either of them ever knowing it happened. His voice had to stay flat. He understood that much without being told. The men at the far end of the radio could not see what he saw. They could only hear him. If his voice climbed, if it cracked, if it did any of the things a frightened voice does, the numbers would come out wrong, and the wrong numbers would land on the wrong ground. He did not know that morning what he was actually looking at. He did not know that the armored columns rolling up the road in front of his observation post represented almost every tank the German army could still move in western France. He did not know that Adolf Hitler had personally ordered this attack over the objection of his own field commanders. He did not know that codebreakers in England had read the German radio traffic and warned the American High Command only a few hours before, and that a general named Omar Bradley had already decided it was too late to do anything except stand and fight. What Weiss knew was simpler and heavier. He knew the infantry battalion he was attached to was surrounded. He knew their commanding officer was dead. He knew that a captain named Reynold Eriksson had taken over a patchwork of riflemen who were out of food, nearly out of water, and running low on radio batteries. And he knew that the one thing standing between those men and a German armored division was the radio in his hand. Down in the valley, inside one of those tanks, there were men who knew far less than Weiss did. Picture one of them, a German sergeant, a Feldwebel, riding forward in the dark with 5 years of war behind him. He had crossed into Poland in 1939. He had watched France collapse in 1940. He had survived the frozen roads of Russia, where he had learned the sound of massed artillery, the way a sailor learns the sound of a coming storm. He believed he knew what he was driving into. He believed there would be a warning. In the artillery he had known, there was always a warning. An enemy gun did not simply land a shell on your head. It fired ranging rounds first. A single shell would fall long, then another short, then closer, while an observer somewhere corrected the aim. A trained soldier learned to read those first rounds. He learned that the first shell was a question, not an answer, and that he had a few precious seconds to find a ditch, a wall, a hole in the ground, before the question became a barrage. That was the bargain his whole life had taught him. The first round bought you time. He had taught that lesson to younger men. Listen for the first shell, he told them. The first shell is a gift. It tells you the enemy has found the range but not yet the target. You have the space of a few breaths to move, and moving is living. He had watched boys grow into soldiers on the strength of that single rule. It had kept him alive across 3 countries and 5 winters. He had no reason, riding through the dark toward Mortain, to believe it would fail him now. On the road below Hill 314, that bargain was about to be broken. What none of the Germans in the valley could understand, as the shells began to come in, was how it was being done. There was an American artillery battery several kilometers behind that hill. It had no line of sight to the road. There was no spotting aircraft in the sky above the fog. There had been no advance warning of their movement, and yet the fire of multiple batteries was coming down onto one specific stretch of pavement, at one specific minute, so precisely that the first salvo arrived before the officers in the lead vehicles could give the order to scatter. There were no ranging rounds, there was no build, there was no question and then an answer. There was only the answer, all at once, and then again, and then again. A German officer captured later that month tried to describe it to his American interrogators. He said the Americans did not fire artillery the way his training had prepared him for. He said the shells came without warning, that the coordinated fire of many batteries arrived in a single sudden impact, and that it kept arriving. He was an officer of a first-rate army. He had been trained in Poland and France and Russia, and he was sitting in a chair trying to tell the men who had captured him that something had happened to him for which 5 years of war had left him completely unprepared. He had counted the seconds once, on one road. 4 seconds, from the first thin sound in the sky to the moment an entire platoon of men he had known simply stopped existing. This is the story of why, by the late summer of 1944, German soldiers on the Western Front had come to believe something their own professional training told them should have been impossible. They had come to believe that American artillery could not be survived if it found you in the open. And it is the story of why that belief, for a specific set of technical and organizational reasons that most of those Germans never quite worked out, was almost exactly correct. It is not the story you would expect. It does not begin with a great general or a secret weapon. It begins in a dusty classroom on the southern plains of Oklahoma more than 15 years before the fog lifted over Hill 314, when a quiet major looked at the way every army in the world fired its guns and decided that every army in the world was doing it wrong. To understand what was killing those Germans in the valley, you have to understand the oldest problem in the history of artillery. Since the moment guns first began firing at targets the gunner could not see with his own eyes, the central problem had always been the same. The man at the gun did not know where the enemy was. The man at the front who could see the enemy did not know how to tell the gun. Between the eye and the weapon there was a gap, and every shell that ever missed fell somewhere inside that gap. Every army in the world, from the late 1860s onward, had solved it the same way. You assigned a battery of guns to an infantry unit. You gave that battery a piece of the front to watch. When something moved, an observer at the front walked the shells onto the target, one round at a time, correcting by voice or by telephone wire, until the rounds were landing where he wanted them. The system was slow, and it was slow by design. Every gun on the battlefield was, in effect, a private contractor working for a single customer. If a larger target appeared, and a commander wanted more guns brought onto it, his request had to travel up a chain of command, be approved, be routed to another unit, and then be calculated from scratch by a different set of gunners who had never seen the target. By the time all of that was finished, the target had usually moved or become a different target or vanished entirely. The Germans accepted this. The French accepted it. The British accepted it. The Russians accepted it. Nobody had a better idea. The one time anyone had tried to mass artillery on a great scale, in the trenches of the First World War, it had required days of careful preparation and rigid timetables that could not be changed once the battle began. The man who refused to accept it was named Carlos Brewer. He had been born in 1890 in a small farming community in Kentucky. He graduated from West Point in 1913, 15th in his class, and he spent most of the 1920s doing the kind of quiet staff work that does not make a man a general in a hurry. In 1928, he arrived at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and Fort Sill in 1928 was not a place ambitious officers dreamed about. It was a dusty post on the southern plains, with few students, almost no modern guns, and a budget a single division would have laughed at. Its field artillery school existed mostly because the Army had to keep the school somewhere. What Fort Sill had was Brewer and a small circle of instructors who believed the same thing he believed. They believed the gun was not the true unit of artillery. The target was. A target, they argued, did not care which battery fired at it. A target did not care about the chain of command or which infantry regiment a particular gun happened to be assigned to. A target cared about one thing only. It cared how many shells arrived, how fast they arrived, and whether the men standing on it had time to take cover before they came down. And from that simple idea came a dangerous question. What if you could make every gun within range fire at the same target, at the same instant, no matter which unit each gun belonged to? You would no longer be firing a fire mission. You would be producing a single, sudden, coordinated event, an entire day of the old artillery compressed into one heartbeat. No army in the world had ever built a machine to do that on demand. In the spring of 1931, on the flat Oklahoma ranges, Brewer ran the first large demonstration of what he was proposing. An entire battalion of guns, spread across a wide training area, brought all of its fire down on a single target in a single concentrated strike. The idea itself was not entirely new. Other armies had imagined it. The difference was that Brewer and his instructors were not imagining it. They were building a system to make it routine, repeatable, and fast, a system that did not depend on a battery commander being a genius. They did not yet know it, but the men they were really building it for were still boys in 1931. Boys like a 21-year-old from Indiana, who would one day lie behind a wall of loose stones on a hill in Normandy, with a dying radio in his hand and a German armored division in the valley below, and prove that the strange idea from the dusty classroom in Oklahoma had been right all along. The system that Carlos Brewer imagined on the ranges of Oklahoma was still only an idea in 1931. An idea is not a weapon. To turn it into something that could reach out and kill a German column on a road in Normandy, other men had to build the machinery, and the machinery was not made of steel. It was made of paper and radio waves and a way of thinking. The next man in the story was a major named Orlando Ward. He took Brewer's demonstrations and he gave them a home. Ward built what came to be called the Fire Direction Center. And the Fire Direction Center was not a gun, and it was not a bunker, and it did not look like anything a soldier of another army would have recognized as a weapon at all. It was a room. In training, it was a plywood room. In combat, it was a tent, or the back room of a Belgian farmhouse, or a cellar with a map pinned to the wall. Inside it were a map, a radio, a telephone switchboard, and a small team of officers and enlisted men. Their only job, the single thing they existed to do, was to take one call from one forward observer at the front and convert it, in a matter of minutes, into a coordinated fire order for every gun within range. Think about what that meant. A young lieutenant lying in the mud at the front no longer had to talk to a single battery. He talked to the room, and the room decided how much of the Army's fire that target deserved, and then the room made it happen, all at once. It helped to picture the room as it actually was, because there was nothing frightening about it to look at. A few folding tables, A map spread flat and weighted at the corners, a grease pencil, a telephone with too many wires running out of it, men in shirt sleeves, sometimes with coffee going cold beside them, speaking in the calm, clipped voice of people who have done a thing 10,000 times. When the call came in from the front, no one shouted. One man read the coordinates back to confirm them. Another plotted the point on the map. A third looked at the target and made the single decision that mattered, which was how much of the army this target was worth. And then the firing data went out over the wires to gun positions scattered across kilometers of countryside, to crews who had never seen the target and never would, and who did not need to. They needed only their printed cards, and their orders, and a few practiced motions of the hands. The quiet of that room was the strangest thing about it. There was no drama in it at all. There was only a group of ordinary men turning a radio call into a storm and then going back to their cold coffee to wait for the next one. But the room could only work if the guns themselves could act fast, and here was the second piece of the machine. It was a strip of printed cardboard, and it was called the graphic firing table. An officer named Aubrey Burns, working with a major named George Kaiser, had built it. There was nothing elaborate about it to look at. It was a printed strip, and on that strip were pre-computed curves for every combination of range, weather, powder temperature, altitude, and barrel wear that a gun might ever encounter. In every other army in the world, a gunner receiving a fire order had to sit down and do the ballistic mathematics from scratch, and that could take 15 minutes, and 15 minutes was a lifetime. An American gunner, handed the same order, could read his firing data directly off the printed strip in under a minute. The rest of the world did artillery by the craftsmanship of trained men. The Americans had taken that craft, and they had printed it on a card. But a card does not print itself. Behind those strips, in a room at Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the curves had to be calculated, one trajectory at a time, and this is the part of the story the war mostly forgot. They were called computers, in the original and literal meaning of the word, which is to say that they were the people who did the computing. Most of them were young women, mathematics graduates from women's colleges on the East Coast, hired on civilian contracts because the men who might otherwise have done the work had been drafted and sent away. Their job was to sit at a desk and run, by hand, the ballistic calculations that produced the curves the gunners at the front would one day read off their cardboard strips. A single trajectory, for a single shell, under a single set of atmospheric conditions, could take one of those women something like 20 hours to compute on a mechanical desk calculator. 20 hours of turning a crank and writing down numbers, for one line on one card. Aberdeen produced thousands of such trajectories. Later in the war, some of those same women would be retrained to run the first general-purpose electronic computer ever built, a machine called ENIAC, which had been constructed partly for this exact purpose. But the firing tables that were in the hands of American gunners at Mortain and in the Ardennes had been calculated before ENIAC existed. They had been calculated by women sitting at desks, turning cranks for 20 hours a shell. No other army in the world had any of this. The Germans, who had the most professional artillery officer corps in Europe, had looked at the idea of centralized fire control and rejected it as impractical. Their doctrine trusted the judgment of the battery commander, the expert at the gun, making his own decisions in his own sector. The British had a fast and clever system that could bring a regiment's worth of guns onto a target in about 3 minutes, and they had been firing coordinated missions of their own in North Africa. The Russians had more guns than the Americans would ever field, but they used them in the old way, in planned barrages on planned timetables, a sledgehammer swung on a schedule. Nobody had what the Americans were quietly assembling. Nobody else had an on-demand network that could, within minutes of a single radio call, put the concentrated fire of dozens of guns onto a piece of ground the size of a farmhouse. And the reason it worked was the part the Germans found hardest to accept, because it insulted everything their tradition believed about war. The American system was designed for amateurs. In 1939, the entire United States Army had fewer than 200,000 men. By 1944, it had grown past 8 million. The field artillery branch expanded at a speed the German army, even at its height, never attempted. It pulled in farm boys from Iowa, who had been calculating seed yields in their heads since they were 12. It pulled in accountants from Chicago and engineers from Pittsburgh and school teachers from Alabama. It gave them 12 weeks of training, handed them the graphic firing tables and the radio procedures, and put them into combat within months. By every rule the German army lived by, this should not have worked. The German gunner was trained for 5 years, or 7. He could do things at his gun through pure skill that no 12-week American could ever match. But that was exactly the point, and the Germans missed it. The German master gunner was one man, doing one brilliant thing, at one gun. The American gunner was one node in a network of hundreds of men, each performing a simple task he had been taught in a few weeks, and those simple tasks added up, at the level of the whole battlefield, to something no amount of individual genius could equal. The Americans had not tried to outcraft the German craftsmen. They had made the craft unnecessary. There was something almost quiet about the cruelty of it when you set it against the German idea of war. The German tradition believed in mastery. It believed that the veteran, the man who had given years of his life to his craft, should prevail over the novice, and that this was not only how war worked, but how war ought to work. It was a soldier's idea of justice. The American system did not share that belief and did not care about it. It took a school teacher from Alabama and a farm boy from Iowa, men who 6 months earlier had never touched a gun, and it arranged them so that their ordinary, replaceable, 12-week competence added up to something that could kill the finest professional soldiers Europe had ever produced, and kill them faster than those professionals could kill back. The German gunner, if he could have seen the whole picture, might have found it obscene. He had earned his skill. The men now beating him had been handed a card, but the target, as the men at Fort Sill had said 15 years before, did not care. The target had never cared. It only counted the shells. You could see the same logic everywhere you looked in the American artillery arm. From 1942 onward, the Americans tied small, unarmed aircraft to their artillery battalions. They were Piper Cubs, mostly, light planes the men called grasshoppers. The pilots were artillery officers, and their only weapon was a radio. They flew low and slow behind the American lines and looked down into the German rear, into the folds of ground where no observer on the earth could see. And when a grasshopper pilot saw a German column moving on a road in daylight, believing itself safe because it was 10 kilometers from the nearest American, he simply spoke into his radio. 5 minutes later, that column could be under the fire of Corps artillery, struck out of an empty sky by guns it never saw, directed by a man in a toy airplane it had barely noticed. Then there was the liaison officer, and the liaison officer was the piece the Germans almost never understood. Every American direct support artillery battalion sent forward observers into combat with the rifle companies, roughly one for each company. That alone was more observers than a German division fielded. But the battalion sent something more. It sent an officer to live at the infantry regiment's headquarters, to sit in on the planning, to listen, and to anticipate what the infantry would need fire on before the infantry commander even asked. When a patrol came back and reported a suspected enemy position, the liaison officer was often already transmitting the coordinates to the Fire Direction Center before the patrol leader had finished making his report. The infantry felt as though it had its own private batteries, waiting on its every word, because from where the infantry stood, that is exactly what it had. The German infantry had nothing like it. A German infantry captain who wanted artillery fire could wait 15 minutes on a good day and all day on a bad one. That was one half of the answer, the American half. The other half was darker, and it belonged to the Germans, and their generals wrote around it in their memoirs for the rest of their lives, without ever quite writing it down. German artillery, which had begun the war as one of the finest fighting arms on earth, had been quietly strangled by 3 things: The first was mobility. In 1944, something close to 80% of the artillery in a German infantry division was still pulled by horses. The tank divisions had motorized guns, but they were the minority, and by the second half of 1944, most of their vehicles had been destroyed, or taken away, or simply could not be fueled. An American infantry division could pick up an entire artillery battalion and move it in under 3 hours. A German infantry division could not reliably move its guns at the speed of the battle its own men were fighting. Again and again the German guns arrived at the front, after the front had already moved on. The second was ammunition. The American Army produced more artillery ammunition during the war than all the other armies of the war, Allied and Axis, combined. The German High Command had been warning its field commanders since 1943 that shells had to be rationed, counted, justified. American guns fired at rates that German gunners could not match, and in many cases could not even imagine. There is a story from Anzio, the Allied beachhead in Italy, and Anzio is worth stopping on, because Anzio is where the Americans first proved to themselves that the machine really worked. The beachhead south of Rome had been landed in January 1944, and by February it came within a hair of being pushed back into the sea. German counterattacks drove toward the water, and what stopped them, as the official American histories openly admit, was the massed fire of corps artillery. The German attacks ran into concentrations heavier and faster shifting than anything those same divisions had met on the Russian front. American documents from those weeks describe fire missions in which 12, 15, 18 battalions of guns were brought down on a single German concentration within minutes of it being spotted. The attacks failed, the beachhead held, and the American artillery branch walked away from Italy, certain that the thing it had been building for 15 years actually worked against a first-rate professional enemy. The third German problem was the deepest, and it was the exact mirror of what the Americans had done. Over the second half of the war, Hitler and the German High Command had pulled artillery decisions upward. The flexible, trust-based system that a good German battery commander was supposed to run had been buried under the same suffocating micromanagement that was gutting the rest of the German army. Big concentrations had to be approved at higher and higher levels. Ammunition had to be justified on paper. A battery commander who in 1940 had been trusted to read his own battlefield and fight his own guns found himself, by 1944, waiting for permission from a headquarters that had never seen the target. Set the two systems side by side, and the whole war on the Western Front begins to make a terrible kind of sense. The Americans had pushed authority down, until a lieutenant in his early 20s could call down the fire of an entire corps with a single sentence into a radio. The Germans had pulled authority up until a trained battery commander could not fire without clearance from 3 levels above him. Slower guns, fewer shells, tighter permission, set against a system that was faster, better supplied, and handed to the man at the front who could actually see the enemy. That was the gap, and the Germans felt it open on top of them every single time. An American bombardment was not larger than what they had endured in Russia. It was shaped differently. It came all at once, without warning, and then it moved when they moved, following them from road to road as though the shells themselves could think. It was not a heavier version of a problem they knew. It was a different kind of problem, and their training had no answer to it. The first great test against a determined enemy in the West came with an operation named Cobra. By July 1944, 6 weeks after the landings, the American Army was still stuck in the hedgerow country south of the Normandy beaches, bleeding in a maze of small fields where the Germans had turned every hedge into a separate fortress. General Omar Bradley's plan to break out was brutally simple. He would pick a narrow strip of front, roughly 6 kilometers wide, and he would concentrate on it an unheard-of weight of bombing and artillery, and then he would ram his divisions straight through the hole. The artillery for Cobra was the largest American concentration of the war to that point. More than 1,000 guns fired on that narrow strip. Some estimates, including those from the German division on the receiving end, put the number closer to 1,200, and they did not simply bombard. The fire plan was a continuous series of time-on-target concentrations, every battery timed so that its shells landed at the same instant as all the others, on its assigned patch of ground. The German division holding that strip was the Panzer Lehr Division, one of the best-equipped armored divisions Germany had. What it experienced on the morning of July 25, 1944, was not a barrage in any sense its men understood. It was a rolling series of massed, simultaneous impacts, laid on and shifted and laid on again, woven together with the bombs of heavy aircraft coming down from above. Its commander would later tell his captors that the division that had stood at full strength that morning had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist by afternoon. He said the greater part of his men had been put out of action before they ever fired a shot in return. For the men who lived through that morning, and not all of them did, the memory would never take the shape of a story. It stayed a collection of fragments. The ground itself lifting and coming down, the pressure of the air changing so violently that it stole the breath out of a man's chest and burst the small vessels in his eyes. Earth pouring into an open hole, faster than a man could dig himself out. A friend beside you in one instant and in the next, simply a part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the churned dirt and the shattered trees. There was no fighting it, because there was no enemy to face. There was no charge to repel, no line to hold, no rifle that could answer what was falling. There was only the ground and the sky and the waiting, and the particular helplessness of a trained soldier who understands, in the middle of it, that every skill he has spent years learning has been made worthless. A man could be the finest infantryman in the German army, and it would not matter. Courage did not matter. Cover did not matter, because the fire moved to wherever the cover was. The only thing that decided whether a man saw the afternoon was where he happened to be lying when the coordinates were read out in a farmhouse he would never see, by men he would never meet, who did not hate him, who did not know his name, and who had already moved on to the next call before his position stopped burning. When the American divisions jumped off into the gap, they found the ground ahead of them broken open, and more than the ground. The nerve of the German defense had been broken with it. The breakout was effectively over in 72 hours. Patton's newly activated Third Army came pouring south through the corridor, and a front that had crawled at 300 meters a day through most of July was suddenly moving 30 kilometers a day. And that, precisely that, is what brought Adolf Hitler to his decision. His answer to an American army that had just erased Panzer Lehr with artillery was to send 4 more armored divisions down open roads, in daylight, toward the same corridor, toward a rocky hill in Normandy where a 21-year-old from Indiana was waiting behind a wall of stones. There was one more thing coming. The Americans had not yet played their last card, and it was a strange and secret one, born not on a battlefield but in a laboratory. It was called the proximity fuse, and historians now rank the science behind it just below radar and the atomic bomb. It was a tiny radio transmitter and receiver, packed into the nose of an ordinary artillery shell. When the shell passed within about 20 feet of a solid object, the signal reflecting back off that object triggered the charge. The result was an airburst, an explosion in the sky above the target rather than on the ground. For the men underneath, it changed everything. A ground burst spent much of its force in the dirt, and a man lying flat in a foxhole was largely safe from it. An airburst sprayed its fragments downward, across a wide circle, into the tops of the holes. A man lying flat was exposed. A man crouched behind a low wall was exposed. There was no posture, short of deep overhead cover, that a soldier could take to save himself. The sky itself became lethal. Building it had been almost impossible. The fuse had to be small enough to fit inside a shell, which meant its delicate radio parts had to survive being fired from a gun barrel, which meant they had to withstand forces something like 20,000 times the pull of gravity at the instant of launch. Vacuum tubes strong enough to live through that did not exist when the war began. The program that produced them, run partly by a laboratory at Johns Hopkins University, and partly by private companies, was one of the most productive scientific efforts of the entire war. The end result was a device smaller than a can of soup, costing a few dollars, that would reliably fire a fragile 1942 radio circuit after being flung out of a cannon. For nearly 2 years, the American command refused to let it be used over land. The fear was simple. A shell that failed to explode might fall into German hands, be taken apart, and copied. So the fuse was used at sea, where a dud sank harmlessly, and over England against the flying bombs, where it destroyed more than 70 of every 100 that came within reach of the guns. But over the land, over the ground where German soldiers dug their holes, it stayed locked away. And so it waited, this small and secret thing, in wooden crates in supply dumps behind the front, while the men who would one day die under it went on believing, for a few weeks longer, that the earth of a foxhole was still a place where a frightened man could hide. The Feldwebel in the valley below Hill 314 did not know any of this. He did not know about the classroom in Oklahoma, or the women at their desks in Maryland, or the plywood rooms with their maps and switchboards, or the fragile little fuse still waiting in an ammunition dump for a commander desperate enough to break the rules. He knew only that the fire that had begun to fall on the roads of Mortain did not behave the way fire was supposed to behave. It did not announce itself. It did not give him his few breaths of warning. It arrived complete, from a clear position he could not find, at the exact moment his column was most exposed, and then it did the one thing artillery was never supposed to be able to do. It followed him. On the rocky summit of Hill 314, the 2 forward observers from the 230th Field Artillery Battalion had dug in several days before the German attack arrived. First Lieutenant Charles Bartz was from Nebraska, 26 years old. Second Lieutenant Robert Weiss was from Indiana, 21. Their radio was a signal corps set running on batteries that had already been partly drained when they carried it up the hill, and that radio was the only reliable link between the summit and the 7 American artillery battalions within range of the roads below. Around them lay the riflemen of the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment, about 700 men. When the German attack struck in the dark, the battalion was surrounded within hours. Its commander was killed early. Captain Reynold Eriksson, an infantry officer, took over the defense of the hill on his own authority and held it. What happened over the next 5 days has been written about many times, and Weiss himself wrote about it decades later, in a memoir he published when he was a retired lawyer in Oregon. But the thing that matters here is not the courage, though the courage was real. It is the mechanics. From the summit, Bartz and Weiss could see every road that led into Mortain. Every German column moving toward the coast had to pass in front of their binoculars. Weiss would see a column. He would read the coordinates into his handset in that flat, careful voice. The Fire Direction Center behind the hill would take the call, judge the target, decide how many battalions it deserved, and send the firing data out to all of them at once. And within 3 minutes, often less, the shells would arrive. Not one battery's worth. On a target that warranted it, the lieutenant on the hill could request core fire, which meant that a 21-year-old, lying behind a wall of loose stones, speaking into a dying radio, could cause every American gun within roughly 20 kilometers to drop its shells onto a single stretch of road at a single moment. The German columns had no way to guess which road, which minute, which piece of pavement. The first round was very often the last round, because the first round arrived on top of them. The battle for the hill was a siege. The Germans knew what that summit was doing to them, and they attacked it again and again, and the ring of riflemen around the observers held them off with rifles and grit and the fire that Weiss and Bartz kept calling down on the slopes. Ammunition ran low. Water ran lower. The wounded lay in the open because there was nowhere to take them, and the batteries on that radio grew weaker by the hour, until every transmission became a small gamble against a set of cells that were dying faster than the men were. By the end of the 5th day, when a battalion from another division finally fought its way through to relieve the hill, more than 300 of the 700 Americans on it were dead or wounded. The battalion received the Presidential Unit Citation. Erickson and 4 company commanders received the Distinguished Service Cross. Weiss and Bartz received the Silver Star. 2 months later, on October 31, 1944, Charles Bartz was killed in action near Aachen, inside Germany. He was 26 years old. He is buried in Lincoln, Nebraska. But the larger thing, the thing that reached far beyond that one hill, was this. The German Armored Corps had been stopped at Mortain. Not primarily by the infantry, though the infantry held. Not primarily by air power, though the air power was terrible once the fog lifted. The engine that broke the German attack was a system of artillery fire that existed in no other army on earth, running on mathematics that had been worked out in a classroom in Oklahoma a decade and a half before, delivered by a boy of 21 on a rock with a dying radio. If a story like that is worth remembering, a moment of your time to like this video helps keep it visible. The famous names of the war are famous already. The lieutenants with the radios are not. The last card was played that winter in the Ardennes. The embargo on the proximity fuse, the secret little device that turned the sky itself into a weapon, was broken not by a decision from the top, but by one commander making a call. On the morning of December 16, 1944, as the great German offensive opened, Colonel Axelson of the 46th Field Artillery Group got an emergency call from cavalry troopers being overrun near a German town. They needed heavy fire, badly. Axelson had the new fuses in his ammunition dump. He also had standing orders never to use them over land. He looked at his situation, decided the emergency outweighed the rule, and authorized them. 3 days later, General Eisenhower formally asked for clearance. 2 days after that, every restriction was lifted across the entire Western Front. On the night of December 25th, Patton's Third Army used the fuse against a German battalion trying to cross a river in the dark. Patton wrote afterward, in a letter to the Chief of Army Ordnance, that the new shell was devastating and that they had killed, by his own count, 702 Germans in that single fire mission. He added that when every army had the shell, the tactics of land war would have to be rewritten. To the north, on a long, open piece of high ground the Americans called Elsenborn Ridge, the same combination of massed artillery and the proximity fuse did more to wreck the German offensive than anything else on the battlefield. Behind the ridge, on the reverse slope, the Americans had gathered the largest continuous block of artillery the United States Army would field in Europe during the whole war. Battalions from every division in the sector, plus corps guns, were pre-registered on the roads and fields the Germans would have to cross. The 12th SS Panzer Division, leading the northern half of the attack, went up that slope in daylight, and went up it again, for the better part of 10 days. It did not get to the top. The attacks were broken apart on the slopes, and by the end, the slopes were covered in German dead. The Army's official history credits the defense of that ridge with inflicting the heaviest casualties of any single American defensive action of the entire battle, and with forcing the whole northern shoulder of the German offensive into terrain that slowed it fatally. The artillery was the reason. There is a last piece of this story, and it is the hardest to write around. After the war, American and British interrogators sat across from captured German officers and asked them, in private rooms, not for any camera, what had actually beaten them in the West. The transcripts run to thousands of pages, and they are held today in the National Archives, open to anyone who wants to read them. And the German officers, over and over, with an uneasy insistence that recurs across the pages, did not point first to American air power, though they respected it. They did not point first to American infantry, though they had learned to respect that too. They pointed to American artillery. General Fritz Bayerlein, who had commanded Panzer Lehr and who had once been Rommel's chief of staff in the desert, described the bombing and shelling that opened Operation Cobra as the worst moment of his career. He told his interrogators that at least 70% of his men had been put out of action in a single morning, and that his front looked like a landscape of the moon. Historians have since argued that the 70% figure was exaggerated, that his division still had some 11,000 men and more than 30 tanks a week later. But the number was never really the point. The point was what Bayerlein believed and what he passed up his chain of command. 2 days after the bombing, a field marshal sent him a courier with an order to hold his position. Bayerlein's reply has become famous in the German military literature. He said his grenadiers, his engineers, his tank crews were all holding their ground. They were lying silent in their foxholes. They were dead. Only the dead, he said, could still hold that line. Bayerlein was captured by the Americans in the last weeks of the war. He lived. He died in 1970. The transcripts of his interrogations are among the more honest documents the German officer corps ever produced about what had happened to them, and they agree with what the rest of the captured officers said. They had been outproduced, out-organized, and out-communicated. They had been struck by a system of fire for which their own proud doctrine had no answer at all. As for the men who built it and the men who ran it, most of them simply went home. Carlos Brewer, the major who had started it all in the dust of Oklahoma, rose to major general during the war. When he was judged too old for a combat command, he refused a desk. He voluntarily gave up his general's rank, reverted to colonel, and took command of an artillery group in Europe, because he wanted to see his own system work in a real war. He saw it. He died in 1976. Orlando Ward, who had built the Fire Direction Center with him, commanded a division in Tunisia and finished the war back at the school. Aubrey Burns, who designed the printed card that made the whole thing fast, never became famous. His name lives in technical manuals. Robert Weiss, the lieutenant on Hill 314, went home to Indiana and then to Oregon. He became a tax attorney. He founded a law firm that still practices today. He wrote his book late in life because, as he put it, the men who had been with him on that hill deserved someone to write down what had happened there. He died in Portland in 2017 at the age of 94. The honest answer to why American artillery felt, to the Germans, impossible to survive is not that the shells were faster than theirs. They were not. It is not that American gunners were better men than German gunners. Man for man, they were not. It is that shells from different guns, different batteries, different battalions, sometimes different corps, had been taught to arrive at the same place at the same instant, on demand, because a small group of officers in a classroom in Oklahoma had decided that the target, and not the gun, was the true unit of artillery. They did not try to be better than the German master gunner. They made him irrelevant. It was not a craft. It was a factory laid over a battlefield, and it worked, and that was the part the German professionals could never forgive, and mostly, in their memoirs, never tried to. If you learned something here, subscribe, and the next of these stories will find you. The men in the fire direction centers, the women at their desks calculating the tables, the lieutenants with the dying radios on forgotten hills, do not get many videos made about them. They deserve to be remembered, not the way the newsreels remembered the war, but the way the men on the other side of the line, waiting in their holes for the shells to stop, actually felt it come down.